Hey guys, welcome to another journey through the quieter corners of history. Tonight, we explore something so fundamental, so deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, that it was mentioned in prayer, regulated by law, and touched the lives of every single person, from the lowliest peasant to the mightiest king. We're talking about bread. Not the soft, uniform loaves you find in grocery stores today, but the dense, varied, and absolutely essential bread of medieval Europe. Close your eyes, if you wish. Get comfortable. Let the weight of your body sink into wherever you're resting. We're going back in time, to an era where the rhythmic sound of grinding grain was as common as traffic noise is today. Our story begins not in a bakery, but in the fields. Imagine the English countryside in the year 1200. Rolling hills stretch as far as the eye can see, divided into long strips of farmland. The three-field system dominates agricultural life. One field grows winter wheat or rye, planted in autumn. Another field holds spring crops like barley or oats. The third field lies fallow, resting, gathering its strength for the next planting season. The peasant farmer wakes before dawn. This has been true for his father, his grandfather, and countless generations before. The rooster's crow is merely a formality. His body knows when to wake. He owns perhaps 30 acres of land, though owns is a strong word. He holds it from his lord, who holds it from a greater lord, who holds it from the king, who holds it from God. This is the feudal contract, as rigid and structured as the bread he will eventually eat. His strips of land are scattered throughout the village fields. This isn't inefficiency, but insurance. Good land and bad land are distributed equally among all the villagers. If blight strikes one area, or if the soil in one section proves particularly poor, no single family bears the full weight of the disaster. He walks to his strips carrying tools that would be familiar to a Roman farmer 1,000 years earlier. The plow, if he's fortunate enough to own one, is wooden with perhaps an iron tip. More likely, he shares a plow with other villagers, and today is his day to use it. The ox that pulls it is communal property, another thing shared among the village. Everything in medieval life is shared or owed or bound by obligation. The wheat grows slowly. Medieval agriculture was not efficient by modern standards. A good harvest might yield 4 grains for every 1 grain planted. A great harvest celebrated and remarked upon for years might yield 6 to 1. Compare this to modern farming, which can yield 50 or even 100 to 1, and you begin to understand why bread was so precious, why wasting it was almost sinful, why laws governed its production so strictly. The wheat stalks sway in the summer breeze. Wheat was preferred, but expensive. It grew best in good soil with adequate rainfall. The nobility ate wheat bread almost exclusively. For everyone else, the crop depended on what their land could support. Rye grew in poorer soil and harsher climates. It was darker, denser, more sour. Barley was cheaper still, often mixed with other grains. And oats, which many considered barely fit for human consumption, were frequently baked into rough cakes by the poorest families. Harvest time arrived like a storm. Every able body in the village turned out to the fields. The grain had to be cut quickly, before weather could ruin it, before it could rot or be eaten by birds. Sickles flashed in the sun. Backs bent over the stalks. Children gathered the cut grain into sheaves. The very old tied the sheaves with practiced hands. From dawn until well past dusk, the village worked. These were some of the longest days of the year, and every hour of sunlight was precious. The cut wheat was bundled and stood upright in the fields to dry. These sheaves, arranged in groups, created a temporary architecture across the landscape. After drying, the grain was carted to the village and stored. Some went to the Lord as rent for the land. Some went to the church's tithe. What remained belonged to the farmer, but he could not simply grind it and bake it. Not yet. There were rules. There were procedures. There was an entire infrastructure built around this single staple food. Part 2. The mill. The grain must be ground into flour. In your mind, picture a medieval village. At its center, perhaps, is a church. Near the church, houses cluster together. Gardens sprawl behind them. And somewhere nearby, almost certainly, is a mill. The sound of the mill was the heartbeat of medieval life. The steady grinding, the splash of water or the creak of wind-caught sails, these sounds meant survival. The mill was owned by the Lord. This was not optional. Peasants were required by law to use their lord's mill. They could not grind grain at home, even if they had the tools. This was called a milling monopoly, and it was enforced with surprising vigor. The penalty for grinding your own grain could be severe: fines, confiscation of the grain, even imprisonment. The Lord took a portion of every farmer's grain as payment for milling. Usually, this was 1/16 of the grain, though it varied by region and by lord. Some were more generous. Some were less. Let's enter a water mill together. The building is usually stone or timber, built directly over a stream or river. The sound hits you first. The rushing water, the groaning of the wooden gears, the thunder of the millstones as they turn. Inside, it's dim and dusty. Flour hangs in the air like mist, coating every surface, getting into your nose and throat. The miller is often a controversial figure in the village. He's necessary, but not always trusted. Millers had a reputation, fair or not, for taking more than their share. The heavy millstones sat one atop the other. The bottom stone, called the bed stone, remained stationary. The top stone, the runner stone, rotated. Grain was poured into a hole in the center of the runner stone and worked its way outward as the stone turned. The friction of stone against stone, with grain between them, created flour. But here's where distrust crept in. The gap between the stones determined how fine the flour would be. Too wide, and the flour was coarse, filled with bits of grain husk. Too narrow, and the stones themselves began to grind together, mixing stone dust into the flour. Stone dust in bread was not just unpleasant, it wore down teeth at an alarming rate. Medieval skeletons show extreme tooth wear, and flour contaminated with grit was a major culprit. Could a dishonest miller adjust the stones to keep more flour for himself? Some villagers certainly thought so. Could he swap good grain for inferior grain while claiming the mill simply produced a poor yield that day? The suspicion was always there, hovering in the dusty air of the mill house. The miller worked long hours. Grain arrived constantly during harvest season. The mill could not stop, because grain that sat unground was grain vulnerable to moisture, to rats, to spoilage. The wooden water wheel turned day and night. In winter, ice was the enemy. The miller might have to break ice repeatedly to keep his wheel turning. In summer, low water meant the mill slowed or stopped entirely. Windmills, more common in flat regions like the Netherlands or eastern England, faced different challenges. No wind meant no grinding. Too much wind could damage the sails or even destroy the entire structure. The flour that emerged was coarser than modern flour. Even the finest medieval flour contained more bran, more fragments of the grain kernel. This wasn't necessarily bad. It meant more fiber, more nutrients. But it also meant the bread was denser, heavier, darker than modern bread. To get truly white flour, the kind preferred by the wealthy, the ground grain had to be sifted repeatedly through progressively finer cloths. This was labor-intensive and expensive. White bread was a status symbol, a visible sign of wealth and rank. Now we have flour. The next step is turning it into bread, and here we enter the world of the professional baker. In cities and large towns, baking was a specialized trade, governed by strict guild regulations. In smaller villages, there might be a communal oven or families might bake at home, though this was increasingly restricted as the medieval period progressed. Let's visit a baker's shop in London in the year 1300. The building is narrow and tall, 3 or 4 stories. The ground floor is the shop itself, open to the street. The oven is in the back. The family lives on the upper floors. The baker rises at 2 or 3 in the morning. Bread baking cannot be rushed, and the first loaves must be ready when the city wakes. The recipe for bread is simple: flour, water, salt, and leaven. The leaven is what we would call a sourdough starter today, a mixture of flour and water that has fermented, capturing wild yeasts from the air. The baker maintains his starter carefully, feeding it regularly, keeping it alive like a pet. Some bakers' starters were decades old, passed down from master to apprentice. The particular mix of yeasts and bacteria in each starter gave each bakery's bread its distinctive flavor. The baker mixes flour and water in a large wooden trough. His apprentice, a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, does much of the physical work. Kneading bread dough for an entire city is exhausting labor. The dough must be worked until it becomes elastic and smooth. This develops the gluten, the protein structure that will trap the gas produced by the yeast and make the bread rise. Once kneaded, the dough is divided and shaped into loaves. The loaves are set aside to rise. This takes hours. In winter, the baker might place the rising loaves near the oven to keep them warm. In summer, they rise more quickly, and he must watch them carefully to prevent overproofing. The oven itself is a massive structure of brick or stone. It has to be. These ovens retain heat for hours, allowing the baker to cook batch after batch of bread without constantly rebuilding the fire. To heat the oven, the baker builds a fire directly inside it using wood or, in regions where wood was scarce, dried peat or even dried animal dung. The fire burns for hours until the bricks are thoroughly heated. Then, and this is crucial, the fire is raked out. The oven floor is swept clean. The bread is baked by the residual heat in the bricks themselves. This method meant the baker had to judge the oven's temperature by experience alone. No thermometers existed. He might throw a handful of flour on the oven floor to see how quickly it browned. He might hold his hand inside briefly to gauge the heat. Get it wrong, and an entire day's bread could be ruined. Too hot, and the outside burned while the inside stayed raw. Too cool, and the bread never properly baked, remaining doughy and unpalatable. The shaped loaves go into the oven on long wooden paddles called peels. The baker works quickly. Speed is essential when the oven is open, because every moment the door remains ajar, heat escapes. Loaves are arranged carefully to ensure even baking. The door is sealed. Now comes the waiting. The smell of baking bread fills the shop and spills out into the street. This smell is one of the defining sensory experiences of medieval city life. To walk through a city at dawn was to walk through clouds of bread scent, each bakery contributing its own particular note to the symphony. After perhaps an hour, the first batch is done. The baker pulls the loaves out, checking their color, tapping their bottoms to hear the hollow sound that indicates proper baking. He has to move quickly because another batch is ready to go in. The oven is still hot enough for several more rounds of baking before it must be fired again. Part 4, the Assize of Bread. But here's where medieval life becomes truly interesting. The baker could not simply sell his bread for whatever price he wished. Bread was too important, too essential to survival, to be left to the free market. Enter the Assize of Bread, a set of regulations that governed bread production in England and many other parts of Europe. The Assize of Bread was remarkably complex. It established a direct relationship between the price of grain and the size of a loaf of bread. When grain prices rose, the loaf got smaller. When grain prices fell, the loaf got larger. But the price of a loaf remained constant, usually set at 1 penny or 1/2 penny. This system was designed to protect consumers from price gouging while still allowing bakers to make a living. Officials called ale tasters, who also inspected bread, would visit bakeries regularly. They weighed loaves to ensure compliance with the assize. A baker who sold underweight bread faced serious penalties. For a first offense, he might be fined. For repeated offenses, he could be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a kind of wooden sled, with the offending loaf hung around his neck. The humiliation was the point as much as the punishment itself. Why such harsh enforcement? Because bread fraud was considered a crime against the entire community. An underweight loaf wasn't just cheating one customer, it was stealing from everyone, particularly from the poor who could least afford it. A family that budgeted carefully might find their weekly bread insufficient to survive if bakers shorted them even slightly. The regulations extended beyond weight. Bread had to be made from the grain advertised. You couldn't sell barley bread as wheat bread. The penalty for this was severe, because it affected not just price, but nutrition. Wheat bread was more nutritious and more digestible than barley bread. Someone who paid wheat prices for barley bread wasn't just being cheated financially, they were being cheated of sustenance. Bakers also could not mix old flour with fresh, or spoiled grain with good grain. All of this seems obvious now, but in an era with no food safety regulations except these guild rules and civic ordinances, these protections were vital. Trust was everything. A baker's reputation was his livelihood. One scandal could ruin him. Not all bread was created equal. Medieval society was hierarchical, and bread reflected this hierarchy perfectly. Let's walk through the varieties available in a medieval city. At the top was wastel bread, sometimes called pain de main or Lord's bread. This was made from the finest wheat flour, sifted multiple times through the finest cloth, until it was almost white. The loaves were small and delicate. Only the wealthy could afford wastel bread regularly. To serve such bread to guests was a mark of respect and a display of wealth. Below wastel came simnel bread, made from good wheat flour but less refined. It was wider than common bread, but not as white as wastel. Simnel bread might appear on the tables of prosperous merchants, successful craftsmen, or minor nobility. It was good bread, bread you could be proud to serve. Common wheat bread, sometimes called cocket, was what most city dwellers ate when they could afford it. It was made from wheat flour that had been sifted once or twice to remove the coarsest bran, but still retained much of the grain's natural color and texture. This bread was heavier than wastel, denser, but nutritious and filling. For those who couldn't afford wheat bread, there was maslin bread, made from a mixture of wheat and rye. The exact proportions varied. More wheat made it more expensive. More rye made it cheaper, but also darker and more strongly flavored. Maslin bread was honest bread, working bread, the bread of laborers and servants. Rye bread itself was common, especially in northern Europe, where rye grew better than wheat. Rye bread was dark, dense and sour. It stayed fresh longer than wheat bread, an important consideration when bread might have to last a family several days. In Germany and Scandinavia, rye bread was not considered inferior, but simply bread. It was their staple, their tradition. Barley bread was cheaper still. It was heavy, not particularly flavorful, and considered by many to be barely suitable for human consumption. Yet barley bread kept people alive during hard times. It was better than oat bread, which was regarded as animal food that desperate people sometimes ate. There was also horse bread, actually baked for horses, but sometimes consumed by the truly desperate during famines. It was made from beans, peas, and the cheapest grains, baked into dense cakes that were hard as rocks. That such bread existed tells you something about the precariousness of medieval life. And then there were trenchers. These were thick slices of stale bread used as plates. At a feast, meat and sauce would be piled onto a trencher. The juices soaked into the bread. After the meal, the trencher, now sodden with gravy and juices, might be eaten, given to servants, or distributed to the poor waiting outside. Trencher bread was usually made from coarse flour specifically for this purpose, baked hard so it wouldn't dissolve too quickly under hot food. What was it like to eat bread every day in medieval Europe? Let's follow a hypothetical family through a day. The family wakes at dawn. The father is a carpenter in a small town. The mother manages the household. There are 3 children, aged 5, 8, and 12. Their day begins with bread. Yesterday's bread, to be specific, because fresh bread is a luxury they might have once or twice a week when the mother bakes, or when someone goes to the baker. The bread sits on the table, hard and dark. It's maslin bread, wheat and rye mixed. The mother cuts thick slices. There is no butter. Butter is expensive. Instead, there might be a bit of lard or some cheese if they're fortunate. More commonly, the bread is dipped in pottage, a thick soup or stew that is the other staple of their diet. The pottage might contain vegetables from their garden, perhaps some dried peas or beans, maybe a bit of bacon if they've recently slaughtered their pig. The children don't complain about the bread because this is what bread is. They've never tasted the soft white loaves we consider normal. To them, bread is substantial, something you have to chew, something that fills your belly and stays with you through a morning of work. The father wraps some bread in a cloth to take to his work site. This will be his midday meal, eaten with whatever he can find to accompany it. Perhaps an onion. Perhaps some ale. The bread is both plate and food. If he has cheese, he places it on the bread. If he has dried fish, he lays it on the bread. The bread catches any crumbs, any juice. Nothing is wasted. The mother, meanwhile, is considering whether to bake. Baking is an all-day affair. First, the flour must be brought out. In their home, it's stored in a wooden chest, hopefully protected from mice and insects, though this is a constant battle. She'll mix the dough in the morning and leave it to rise. She doesn't have her own oven. Few private homes do. Fire is too dangerous in these cramped wooden buildings. Instead, she'll take her risen dough to the communal oven in the village square. She'll pay the baker a small fee to use his oven after he's finished his own commercial baking. Several other women will be there too, waiting their turn. They'll chat while they wait, exchanging gossip, recipes, complaints. This communal baking is a social event as much as a necessity. Or perhaps she'll simply buy bread from the baker. This is becoming more common as the medieval period progresses. Professional bakers are more efficient. They have better ovens. Their bread is more consistent. And as more people work in trades rather than farming, fewer people have time for home baking. By evening, the family gathers again. Supper is similar to breakfast, pottage and bread. If they're fortunate, there might be some ale to drink. Water was often unsafe, so ale, which was boiled during production, was safer. Ale was also food in its own right, thick with calories from the grain. Small ale, weak ale, was what children drank. The day ends as it began, with bread. It is the foundation of everything. When times are good, there is bread and something to go with it. When times are hard, there is bread and hope that tomorrow will bring something to go with it. When times are terrible, there is not enough bread, and people suffer. It is impossible to discuss medieval bread without discussing famine. The medieval food supply was precarious. One bad harvest could mean widespread hunger. 2 bad harvests meant famine. 3 bad harvests meant disaster of biblical proportions. Consider the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It began with rain. Not ordinary rain, but relentless rain that started in the spring of 1315 and barely stopped for months. Fields flooded. Grain rotted in the ground or sprouted before it could be harvested. What little grain was salvaged was often moldy, dangerous to eat. Salt couldn't be produced because seawater couldn't be evaporated without sun. Without salt, meat couldn't be preserved. The price of wheat in England increased by 800%. Most people couldn't afford bread at any price. They ate anything they could find: roots, bark, grass, even soil mixed with a little flour to fill their stomachs. Diseases of malnutrition appeared: scurvy, pellagra, edema from protein deficiency. People became walking skeletons. The chroniclers of the time report parents eating their own children, though whether this actually happened or was horrified speculation is unclear. The impact of the famine lasted years beyond the actual crop failures. Weakened by hunger, people were more susceptible to disease. The population of Europe didn't recover for decades. The Great Famine set the stage for the Black Death 30 years later. A population already weakened by hunger had little resistance to plague. Bread, or the lack of it, could topple kingdoms. When people are hungry, they revolt. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 had many causes, but underlying them all was the basic question: could ordinary people afford bread? Bread riots occurred throughout medieval Europe. When bakers were caught selling underweight loaves during times of shortage, the mob might destroy their shops or worse. Governments understood this. Keeping bread affordable was a matter of political survival. This is why the Assize of Bread existed. This is why grain was stockpiled in good years. This is why some cities maintained strategic reserves of grain, essentially the medieval equivalent of modern strategic oil reserves. Bread wasn't just physical sustenance in the Middle Ages, it was spiritual sustenance as well. The most sacred moment in the Christian Mass is the consecration of the host, when bread and wine become, according to Catholic doctrine, the literal body and blood of Christ. This bread, called the host, was special. It had to be made from the purest wheat flour, mixed only with water, containing no leaven. It was unleavened bread, similar to Jewish matzah, connecting Christian practice to older traditions. The host was thin, white, and round. Baking the host was often done by priests themselves or by nuns in convents. It was too sacred a task to entrust to commercial bakers. The theology of the Eucharist meant that bread had profound religious significance. Christ called himself the bread of life. The Lord's Prayer asks for our daily bread. Jesus fed the multitudes with bread and fish. Bread was everywhere in Christian scripture and practice. This religious significance spilled over into ordinary life. To waste bread was sinful. To throw bread away was unthinkable. Old bread was eaten or fed to animals, or used as trenchers or broken up into other dishes. The reverence for bread as a gift from God was deeply ingrained. People made the sign of the cross over bread before cutting it. If bread fell on the floor, it was picked up and kissed before being eaten, asking God's forgiveness for the disrespect. Monasteries and convents were major producers and consumers of bread. A large monastery might maintain its own mill and bakery. Monks ate bread at nearly every meal, along with soup, vegetables, and occasionally fish. Meat was often forbidden by monastic rules, making bread even more important as a source of calories. Religious houses also distributed bread to the poor. This was considered a sacred duty. At the monastery gates, every day, bread was given out to those who needed it. The amount varied by the wealth of the institution, and the severity of local need, but the practice was universal. This charity was not optional. It was commanded by Scripture. What you did for the least of these, you did for Christ. Some saints were particularly associated with bread. Saint Nicholas allegedly provided bread to the poor. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was said to have hidden bread in her cloak to give to beggars against her husband's wishes. When he confronted her and demanded to see what she was hiding, the bread miraculously transformed into roses. True or not, the story reveals the medieval association between sanctity and generosity with bread. A traveler moving through medieval Europe would encounter remarkable variety in bread, despite the universal importance of the staple. In Italy, especially in cities like Florence and Venice, white bread made from wheat was common even among relatively ordinary people. Italy's wealth from trade and banking, combined with its favorable climate for growing wheat, made good bread more accessible. Italian bakers developed sophisticated techniques. They understood how different flours behaved. Some Italian bread was leavened with beer yeast rather than sourdough, producing a milder flavor. Travel north to Germany and rye dominates. German rye bread was dense, dark, and strongly flavored. It kept for weeks, which was essential in a region with harsh winters. Some German breads incorporated spices like caraway or fennel. Others mixed in fruit or nuts, though these were special occasion breads rather than daily fare. In France, the baguette wouldn't appear until centuries later, but French bakers were already developing a reputation for skill. French bread regulations were particularly strict. The guilds maintained high standards. Paris had specialized bakers. Some made only white bread, others only brown bread. The competition pushed quality higher. Scandinavia relied heavily on rye and barley. The growing season was short, and wheat struggled in the northern climate. Norwegian flatbrød, Swedish knäckebröd, these crisp, dry breads could be stored for months, even years. They were baked in huge batches during favorable weather and hung from the ceiling on poles. When needed, a piece of this flat bread would be broken off and softened by dipping in soup or milk. In Spain, the Moorish influence introduced techniques and ingredients from North Africa. Some Spanish breads incorporated olive oil, creating a richer, more flavorful loaf. The Reconquista meant Christian and Islamic bread-making traditions existed side by side, sometimes learning from each other, sometimes remaining distinct. Eastern Europe showed yet another pattern. In Poland and Russia, rye bread was supreme. The Russian black bread, dense and sour, was baked in dome-shaped loaves. Some Polish breads mixed buckwheat with rye. In regions where ovens were scarce, breads were often cooked on hot stones or in ashes, producing flat cakes rather than loaves. The British Isles had their own traditions. Oat cakes were common in Scotland and northern England. These weren't like modern oatmeal, they were thin, crispy cakes of oats, eaten with cheese or fish. Wales had bara serch, similar oat breads. Ireland, when it could grow wheat, produced excellent bread, but barley and oats were more reliable in the damp climate. Medieval bread-making might seem primitive, but it represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and gradual technological improvement. Understanding medieval bread means understanding the tools and techniques that made it possible. The plow, which we mentioned earlier, was crucial. The heavy plow that could turn the thick soils of northern Europe was a revolutionary technology. It appeared gradually between the 6th and 10th centuries. This plow, pulled by teams of oxen, didn't just scratch the surface of the soil like ancient plows. It cut deep, turned the soil over, created furrows for better drainage. This increased yields dramatically. More grain meant more bread. The three-field system of crop rotation was another key innovation. Instead of leaving half your land fallow every year, you only left a third fallow. This increased the productive capacity of medieval agriculture by about 50%. More land in production meant more grain, meant more bread. Mills themselves improved. Early medieval mills were simple structures. By the late medieval period, engineering had advanced considerably. Here ratios were better understood. Mills became more efficient. Some mills had multiple sets of stones, grinding different grains simultaneously. In areas with strong winds or fast rivers, mills could become quite large, serving multiple villages. Ovens evolved too. The earliest bread was probably baked on hot stones. Then came pit ovens, holes dug in the ground, lined with stones, and filled with fire. The bread was placed on the hot stones after the fire was removed. Gradually, above-ground ovens appeared, with proper chimneys to control smoke, better insulation to retain heat longer, and improved designs that distributed heat more evenly. Yeast was not understood scientifically. Medieval bakers knew that if they saved some dough from one day, it would make the next day's dough rise, but they didn't know why. They didn't know about microorganisms. They thought of it as magic or as a gift from God. Different regions had different traditions for maintaining their leaven. Some swore by keeping it buried in flour. Others kept it in liquid. Some kept it warm, others kept it cool. All of this worked because wild yeasts are everywhere, and given flour and water, they'll ferment. The specific practices of each region selected for different yeast strains, creating regional variations in bread flavor. Measuring was imprecise. There were no standardized measuring cups or spoons. Bakers learned by feel, by experience. A good baker knew how the dough should feel. Too sticky, add more flour. Too stiff, add more water. The dough talks to you if you know how to listen. This is still true today, even with our precise measurements. Baking remains partly art, partly science, partly intuition. Bread was a marker of status throughout medieval society. What bread you ate announced your place in the social hierarchy as clearly as your clothes or your manner of speech. A great lord dining in his hall would have wastel bread. The finest white bread would be placed before him on the high table. He might not eat all of it. Indeed, he probably wouldn't. Part of displaying wealth was displaying abundance. Leftover bread from the Lord's table was a valuable commodity. It went to his servants, who considered it a significant part of their compensation. A knight or minor noble would eat simmo bread or good wheat bread. His household would eat maslin bread or common wheat bread. His servants would eat whatever bread they could get, probably dark rye or barley bread. A merchant might be wealthier than some knights, but social status and wealth weren't perfectly aligned. A successful wool merchant might eat better bread than a poor knight, but society still considered the knight higher in rank. Bread became a way to assert or claim status. If you could afford white bread, you ate white bread at dinner parties, making sure your guests noticed. For the urban poor, bread was a constant struggle. They earned perhaps 2 or 3 pence a day as laborers. A loaf of bread cost a penny or a half penny. This meant that feeding a family required the entire household to work. Children as young as 7 or 8 were employed at simple tasks. Mothers took in spinning or laundry. Fathers worked from dawn to dusk. Still, there were days when there wasn't enough bread. Rural peasants had a different relationship with bread. They grew the grain themselves, but they didn't necessarily control it. They owed rent to their lord. They owed tithes to the church. After these obligations were met, what remained was theirs. In a good year, this was sufficient, with some left over to sell for cash or save for the next planting. In a bad year, it wasn't enough. Peasants would find themselves buying grain to eat, the same grain they had grown, because they'd been forced to give so much away in rents and tithes. Bread also marked the passage of the year. White bread appeared at Easter and Christmas, even on tables where it was rare the rest of the year. Families saved and planned for these occasions. A white loaf at Christmas wasn't just bread, it was a symbol of the holiday, of special times, of hope and celebration. Fresh bread was a luxury. Most bread was at least a day old, often several days old. This meant that preservation and storage were crucial skills. Bread was stored in bread boxes, or bread cupboards, usually wooden structures with ventilation holes to allow air circulation. The worst enemy of bread was moisture, which caused mold. Dry air kept bread hard but edible. Hard bread could be softened by dipping it in soup, ale, or milk. Some breads were deliberately baked hard to extend their life. Ship's biscuit, also called hardtack, was baked so dry and hard that it could last for months or even years. Sailors ate it on long voyages. Armies marched on it. It was barely bread anymore, more like compressed grain in bread form, but it kept men alive when nothing else was available. Trencher bread, which we discussed earlier, was made from day-old or older bread. Fresh bread was too soft to serve as a plate. It would dissolve too quickly under hot food. Stale bread worked perfectly. This is an example of medieval practicality. Nothing was wasted. Stale bread wasn't inferior, it was just bread suitable for a different purpose. In cold climates, bread could be frozen. A loaf frozen solid would keep for weeks. When needed, it would be thawed and toasted or boiled into a mush. Some Russian and Scandinavian breads were specifically designed to be frozen and thawed repeatedly without losing too much quality. Mold was a constant problem. Not all mold is equally dangerous. Some molds that grow on bread are relatively harmless. Others produce mycotoxins that can cause serious illness. Medieval people didn't understand this scientifically, but they knew from experience that moldy bread could make you sick. Generally, moldy sections were cut away and the rest of the bread eaten. In times of severe shortage, even moldy bread might be consumed, risks be damned. Ergot poisoning deserves special mention. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye. It produces alkaloids that cause hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire because of the burning sensation in the extremities it caused. Outbreaks of ergotism occurred regularly, especially in wet years when the fungus thrived. Some historians speculate that the Salem witch trials may have been triggered in part by ergot poisoning, though this theory is controversial. When crisis struck, bread revealed its central importance to medieval life. War, plague, and social upheaval all affected bread supply and bread consumption in dramatic ways. During wars, armies required enormous quantities of bread. A medieval army marched on its stomach, and the stomach wanted bread. Feeding an army meant stripping the surrounding countryside of grain. Peasants who had grown the grain and needed it to survive themselves watched helplessly as soldiers requisitioned it. Armies also disrupted planting and harvest. Fields trampled by armies produced no grain. Mills destroyed by invading forces ground no flour. The 100 Years' War between England and France saw regions devastated by the constant movement of armies. Areas that had been productive farmland became depopulated wastelands. Without labor to work the fields, grain production collapsed. Without grain, bread disappeared. Famine followed war as predictably as night followed day. The Black Death, which killed perhaps a third to half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, paradoxically improved the lives of survivors in some ways. With fewer mouths to feed and the same amount of land, food became more plentiful. Wages rose because labor was scarce. Surviving peasants could demand better conditions from lords desperate for workers. Bread became more affordable and of better quality for many people. But the plague also disrupted the social order. In some regions, there weren't enough people left to harvest grain. Fields full of ripe wheat rotted because everyone who knew how to use a sickle was dead. Mills stood silent because the miller and his apprentices were gone. Bakeries closed because the baker and his entire family had died. Urban riots often centered on bread. When bread was scarce or expensive, anger focused on bakers, grain merchants, and city officials responsible for regulating the markets. Rioters might break into bakeries and distribute bread to the crowd. They might attack granaries and seize stored grain. This wasn't mindless violence. It was a desperate population trying to survive. Governments responded with a mix of force and accommodation. Troops might be called in to restore order, but authorities also knew they had to address the underlying problem. Grain might be imported from other regions. Price controls might be tightened. Hoarders would be prosecuted. The goal was always the same: ensure bread was available at a price people could afford. Bread permeated medieval culture in ways beyond mere nutrition. Proverbs, stories, laws, and customs all reflected bread's central importance. "Half a loaf is better than none" is a medieval proverb that still exists today. It expresses a fundamental medieval reality: take what you can get, because getting nothing is worse. The proverb makes sense in a world where many people regularly experienced actual hunger. The upper crust, as a term for the social elite, comes from bread. The top of a loaf, the crust, was considered the best part. It was cleaner, having been exposed to the air rather than touching the floor of the oven. At meals, the upper crust might be given to the most important person at the table. Sharing bread created bonds. To break bread with someone was to establish fellowship. This wasn't just metaphorical. Actually sitting down and eating together, sharing bread from the same loaf, created social obligations. You didn't betray someone you'd broken bread with. This is why the betrayal of Judas was so shocking to medieval Christians. He'd broken bread with Christ at the Last Supper and then betrayed him anyway. Bread appears in medieval literature constantly. In Piers Plowman, a 14th-century English poem, bread symbolizes honest labor and Christian charity. The poem distinguishes between bread earned through work and bread obtained through begging or dishonesty. This moral dimension of bread reflected medieval values. In medieval romances, the quality of bread served at a feast indicated the host's wealth and generosity. When Sir Gawain arrives at a castle, the description of the food served, especially the bread, tells readers what kind of place this is. Fine white bread means a rich, welcoming household. Coarse bread suggests poverty or inhospitality. Bread featured in medieval folk customs. At weddings, bread might be broken over the bride's head for good luck. At Christmas, special breads were baked with symbols pressed into them. Hot cross buns marked Good Friday, though the familiar crossed bun we know today developed somewhat later. Superstitions surrounded bread. Turning a loaf upside down was unlucky. Leaving a knife stuck in a loaf invited the devil. Burning bread brought bad fortune. These beliefs, however silly they seem now, reflected the deep respect and quasi-religious reverence medieval people felt for bread. The medieval bread system began to transform in the late 1400s and 1500s. Several factors contributed to this change, though the transition was gradual and uneven across Europe. New World crops, particularly potatoes and maize, began to supplement grain as a source of calories. The potato especially would eventually become as important as bread in some regions, though this took centuries. For now, it's enough to note that bread's monopoly on the carbohydrate supply began to weaken. Improvements in agricultural technology increased yields. Better plows, better crop rotation systems, and the gradual enclosure of common lands led to more efficient farming. More grain meant cheaper bread. Cheaper bread meant fewer people living on the edge of starvation. The Reformation fractured the religious unity of Europe. The Protestant rejection of transubstantiation, changed the symbolic meaning of bread. If the host wasn't literally Christ's body, if it was just bread, then perhaps all bread wasn't quite as sacred. This is oversimplifying, but the point is that bread's religious significance began to diminish in Protestant areas. The rise of nation-states and more effective governments changed how bread was regulated. The medieval system of local regulations enforced by guilds gradually gave way to national laws. The Assize of Bread in England continued until 1815, but it became increasingly difficult to enforce as markets became more complex and more interconnected. Urbanization accelerated. More people lived in cities. Fewer people baked at home. Professional bakers became more important. The baker's shop became less of a neighborhood necessity and more of a business competing in a marketplace. But these changes came slowly. A peasant family in rural France in 1600 would still live much as their ancestors had in 1300. They'd still wake at dawn, work the fields, mill their grain, and eat bread that would be familiar to someone from centuries earlier. For most people, most of the time, bread remained what it had always been: the staff of life, the foundation of survival, the one thing you couldn't do without. Let us return now to where we began, standing in a medieval field, watching wheat sway in the breeze. But now we understand what that wheat means. We understand the labor required to grow it, thresh it, mill it, and bake it. We understand the laws that govern its sale, the customs that surround its consumption, the desperation that comes when it's lacking. Medieval bread was not like modern bread. It was heavier, denser, coarser. It required strong teeth and a strong stomach. But it kept millions of people alive for centuries. It was the baseline, the foundation, the one constant in lives filled with uncertainty and hardship. When medieval people prayed for daily bread, they meant it literally. They were asking God for the one thing they needed most, the one thing without which everything else was meaningless. Bread was survival. Bread was community. Bread was the thin line between life and death. And now, if you're still awake, and you probably shouldn't be by this point, you know more about medieval bread than most historians. You've traveled through time, across Europe, into bakeries and churches and peasant cottages and castle halls. You've seen bread as the center of economic life, social life, and spiritual life. Rest now. Let the knowledge of medieval bread fade into dreams. Perhaps you'll dream of wheat fields stretching to the horizon, or the warm smell of baking bread, or the sound of millstones grinding grain into flour. Whatever you dream, sleep well. And when you wake, perhaps you'll see the bread in your kitchen a little differently, understanding the centuries of human effort and ingenuity and desperation that lie behind even the simplest loaf.